I should have known something was wrong when they gave us the suicide mission with a smile. Major Collins stood behind his metal desk at DEWPOW3, steam rising from his coffee cup like smoke from a funeral pyre. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made even healthy men look dead. Outside, the Alaska wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass like skeletal fingers. "Strauss, you and your team are going out to the ice fields," Collins said, not looking up from the mission folder. "Routine maintenance on the ANFPS-23 radar units. Sky Shield 2 has them running hot, and we need those eyes in the sky sharp." I felt my jaw tighten. Nothing was ever routine when they sent you that far out. The sea ice stretched for miles beyond the base, dotted with isolated radar stations like lonely tombstones. Each one monitored Soviet aircraft movements during the Cold War exercises, but the extreme cold played hell with the electronics. "How long are we talking, sir?" I asked, tasting copper in my mouth. The same metallic taste I'd had when they told me about Tommy's bomber going down over Korea. 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather turns. Collins finally looked up, his pale eyes studying my face. "Problem, Captain?" My brother Tommy had been a radar operator too. His B-29 had crashed during a routine reconnaissance mission, and they'd found the wreckage scattered across a frozen mountainside. The official report blamed equipment failure. I'd blamed myself for not pushing him to transfer to a safer posting. "No problem, sir. Just want to make sure my team's properly briefed." That's when I met them in the briefing room. Staff Sergeant Mike Nelson, call sign Grizz, sat hunched over a cup of black coffee. His weathered face told stories of Normandy and the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir. The man had seen enough death to fill a cemetery, but he still volunteered for the dangerous assignments. Corporal Yuri Petrov perched on the edge of his chair like a bird ready to fly. His Russian accent had faded over the years, but his nervous energy never did. He'd come to America as a child, escaping Stalin's purges, and now he helped translate intercepted Soviet communications. Lieutenant Ray O'Donnell lounged against the wall, his pristine uniform pressed to regulation perfection, fresh out of the academy, all polish and no scars. He hid his fear behind jokes and military bearing, but I could see it in his eyes. The same look Tommy had before his last mission. And then there was tech specialist Julia Chung, the only woman on the base who could make a radar unit sing opera. Her gentle voice had talked more than one panicked pilot safely home through Arctic storms. She had a way of keeping everyone grounded when the world started spinning out of control. "Gentleman, lady," I began, spreading the mission map across the table. "We're heading to 4 radar stations across the Beaufort Sea ice. Each station needs calibration and maintenance. The weather forecast shows clear skies, but we all know how fast that can change out there." Grizz grunted his approval. "How's the ice thickness, Captain?" "Solid. At least 6 feet where we're going. The helicopter can land safely at each station." I traced our route with my finger, noting the distances between sites. "We'll work in pairs, check each unit, log the readings, and move on. Standard procedure." O'Donnell raised his hand like he was still in school. "What about local support?" "Any Inuit guides?" I'd tried to arrange for a guide, but the conversation still bothered me. The old Inuit man at the trading post had shaken his head when I mentioned our destination. "You go to the crying woman's territory," he'd said in broken English. "She takes men who wander too far from home, takes them down to her ice house, where they weep forever. I'd dismissed it as superstition, but the man's fear had been real. His hands had trembled as he'd drawn a crude map, marking areas to avoid. No local guides available, I told the team. We're on our own out there. Julia leaned forward, studying the map. These stations are pretty isolated. What's our backup communication plan? Daily radio checks with base at 0800 and 1800 hours. If we miss 2 consecutive checks, they'll send out a search and rescue bird. I folded the map, the paper crackling like old bones. Any other questions? The room fell silent except for the building's constant groaning against the wind. I could feel the weight of their trust, the same burden I'd carried with Tommy. The difference was, this time, I wouldn't let anyone down. Gear up. We leave at 6 a.m. tomorrow. As they filed out, Grizz lingered behind. You okay, Captain? You look like you've seen a ghost. I almost told him about Tommy, about the dreams where my brother's voice called out through howling wind. Instead, I just nodded. Just want to get this mission done right, Sergeant. He studied me with those old soldier's eyes, seeing more than I wanted him to. Yeah, I know that feeling. Sometimes the ice out there gets in your head, makes you hear things that ain't there. You stick to the mission, Captain. Keep your people close. After he left, I sat alone in the briefing room staring at the map. The radar stations looked so small, so vulnerable against the vast expanse of white. Somewhere out there, the wind carried echoes of the past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something that had been waiting for us all along. The helicopter blades chopped through the morning air like a giant's heartbeat, steady and rhythmic against the pale Arctic sky. I pressed my face to the small window, watching the landscape change from brown tundra to endless white. The sea ice stretched to the horizon, broken only by pressure ridges that rose like frozen waves. First drop in 20 minutes, the pilot's voice crackled through my headset. Below us, the world looked empty and clean, but I knew better. The Arctic was a living thing, always shifting, always hungry. Julia sat across from me, checking her equipment bag for the 3rd time. Her breath came in small puffs, visible even inside the heated cabin. Readings are going to be tricky in this cold, she said, more to herself than to me. Electronics don't like 40 below. Petrov sat rigid in his seat, knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. The weapon was standard issue for Arctic operations. Polar bears could show up anywhere, and a panicked bear was deadlier than any Soviet fighter jet. Relax, Yuri, O'Donnell called over the engine noise. It's just maintenance work. We'll be back at base drinking hot coffee before you know it. But Petrov's eyes stayed fixed on the endless white below. My grandmother used to tell stories about the ice, he said quietly. She said it remembers everything. Every person who died out there, every last breath. Grizz snorted. Your grandmother never had to service a radar array in a blizzard. Trust me, the only thing dangerous out here is frostbite and equipment failure. The helicopter banked sharply, and I saw our first target, a small metal building squatting on the ice like a mechanical tick. The radar dish rotated slowly, its mesh surface already coated with frost. A generator hummed somewhere inside the structure, the only sign of life in this frozen desert. There she is, I said, pointing down. Station Alpha 7. We'll spend the morning here, then move to Bravo 4 this afternoon. The pilot set us down 50 yards from the station, rotor wash kicking up a cloud of snow crystals that sparkled like broken glass in the sunlight. The moment we stepped out, the cold hit like a physical blow. The air was so clear it hurt to breathe, each inhalation like swallowing ice water. Jesus, O'Donnell gasped, his words coming out in white puffs. How cold is it? I checked my thermometer. -38, and that's without wind chill. We moved quickly to the station, our boots crunching on snow that squeaked like styrofoam. The metal door was frozen shut, requiring Grizz's shoulder to force it open. Inside, the warmth felt like salvation, even though it was probably only 20 degrees above zero. The radar equipment filled most of the small building, banks of vacuum tubes glowing like amber eyes, switches and dials covering every surface. A steady electronic hum filled the air, punctuated by the rhythmic sweep of the radar dish outside. Julia went to work immediately, plugging her test equipment into various ports and reading the displays. Signal strength is down 15%, she announced, and there's some kind of interference on the lower frequencies. I logged the readings in my notebook while Petrov monitored the radio. Base, this is Arctic Maintenance Team Alpha. We're on station at Alpha 7, beginning diagnostic procedures. The radio crackled with static before the reply came through. Copy, Alpha Team. You're coming through loud and clear. Weather forecast shows clear skies for the next 48 hours. But even as the voice faded, I noticed something odd. Underneath the normal static, there was something else. A soft sound, almost like breathing. I adjusted the frequency dial, but the sound remained. You getting that too? I asked Petrov. He nodded, his face troubled. It's probably atmospheric interference. Solar activity can cause all kinds of strange signals. Julia looked up from her equipment. I'm reading some odd patterns here. The radar's picking up echoes from areas where there shouldn't be any reflective surfaces. O'Donnell peered over her shoulder at the oscilloscope screen. Green lines danced across the dark glass, forming patterns that looked almost like waveforms. Maybe it's ice formations. Pressure ridges can create false returns. Maybe, Julia said, but she didn't sound convinced. We worked for 3 hours, adjusting calibrations and replacing worn components. The interference patterns persisted, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but always there. As we prepared to leave for the next station, Grizz noticed something that made my blood run cold. Captain, you need to see this. He was standing outside, pointing at the ice around the station. In the snow, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were marks. Not animal tracks. These were too precise, too deliberate. They looked like scratches, as if something with claws had been dragging itself across the frozen surface. Polar bear? O'Donnell suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Grizz knelt beside the marks, his experienced eyes studying the pattern. Never seen bear tracks like these, too deep, and the spacings all wrong. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The marks formed rough circles around the station, as if something had been pacing, waiting, watching. In the center of each scratch, the ice was darker, almost black. Equipment malfunction at the next station could be more serious than we thought, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Let's move out. As we lifted off, I looked back at Station Alpha 7. The scratches in the ice seemed to move in the rotor wash, like fingers reaching up from beneath the frozen surface. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something over the helicopter's engine. A sound like crying, carried on the Arctic wind. The second station sat like a metal coffin on the ice, its antenna array reaching toward a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening, swallowing the pale sun. I could taste snow in the air, metallic and sharp. "Bravo 4 coming up," the pilot announced, but his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. "Wind's picking up. I can give you 4 hours before I need to get back to base." As we circled for landing, I saw that this station was different, older. The paint had been scoured away by years of Arctic storms, leaving the metal gray and scarred. Ice hung from the antenna like frozen tears, and the building itself seemed to lean slightly, as if the permafrost beneath had shifted. Julia was already checking her instruments before we touched down. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," she said, frowning at her equipment. "Something's causing massive interference." We unloaded quickly, the wind cutting through our parkas like cold knives. Petrov stumbled as we approached the station, catching himself against the metal wall. When he straightened, his face was pale beneath his fur-lined hood. "You okay, Yuri?" I asked. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Just thought I heard." "Never mind. It's nothing." The station door was already open, hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. The radar equipment hummed and clicked, but the sounds were different from the first station. More irregular, like a machine trying to remember how to breathe. "Power levels are fluctuating," Julia reported, her voice tight with concern. "And the signal patterns." She trailed off, staring at her oscilloscope. I looked over her shoulder at the screen. The green lines weren't forming the normal radar returns. Instead, they looked like audio waveforms, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, almost like music. "Could be a transmission leak from the Soviet side," O'Donnell suggested, but he was whispering. The station had that effect on us. It demanded quiet, like a church or a morgue. Petrov was hunched over the radio, adjusting frequencies with shaking hands. "Base, this is Arctic Team Alpha. We're experiencing unusual readings at Station Bravo 4. Request technical support." Static filled the radio, thick and hostile. Through the white noise, something else came through, faint but unmistakable. A voice, crying. "Did you hear that?" Petrov's voice cracked like a teenager's. We all froze, listening. The radio hissed and popped, and then it came again. A woman's voice, distant and mournful, calling out in a language none of us recognized. The sound made my skin crawl, raising every hair on my arms. "Atmospheric disturbance," Grizz said, but his hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Solar flares can cause all kinds of strange radio phenomena." Julia was working frantically at her equipment, trying to isolate the signal. "It's not coming from outside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The signal's originating from beneath us, from under the ice." The crying grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that matched the pulse of my own heartbeat. The sound seemed to seep into my bones, making my teeth ache. "We need to get this equipment calibrated and get out of here," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. But even as I spoke, I felt something familiar in that distant voice. A loneliness that matched my own, a grief that echoed the loss of my brother. Petrov suddenly stood up, his chair clattering to the floor. "Babushka?" he called out, his voice full of hope and terror. "Babushka, is that you?" "Sit down, Corporal," I ordered, but he was already moving toward the radio, his hands reaching for the controls. "She's calling me," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She's been waiting for me. She says She says I should come home. Grizz grabbed Petrov's arm, pulling him away from the radio. That's not your grandmother, son. That's just interference. But Petrov struggled against the sergeant's grip, his eyes wild with desperate hope. You don't understand. She died when I was 7, but she promised she'd always be there for me. She promised. The crying from the radio suddenly stopped, leaving only the hollow hiss of static. In the silence that followed, we could hear the wind outside, growing stronger, more violent. The station creaked and groaned around us like a ship in a storm. Julia's equipment began beeping frantically. I'm reading massive electromagnetic disturbances, she reported, her professional calm cracking. The patterns they're not natural. Someone or something is broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously. I moved to the window and wiped away the frost with my glove. Outside, the storm clouds had grown darker, more threatening. But it wasn't the weather that made my blood freeze. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, I saw a figure. A woman in white, standing motionless on the ice. Jesus Christ, I breathed. What is it? O'Donnell asked, joining me at the window. I pointed to where I'd seen her, but the figure was gone. Only empty ice stretched to the horizon, broken by the shadows of pressure ridges that looked like frozen gravestones. Nothing, I said, but my hands were shaking. Just thought I saw something. As we worked to complete the calibration, the crying started again. This time, it was closer, more personal. And as it echoed through the station, I could have sworn I heard another voice, mixed in with the woman's lament. Tommy's voice, calling my name across the frozen wasteland of my guilt. Station Charlie 9 appeared through the blowing snow like a ship emerging from fog. The storm had been building all afternoon, and by the time we approached the third radar installation, visibility was down to 50 yards. Ice crystals stung my face like angry wasps, and the wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human. This is getting dangerous, the pilot shouted over the engine noise. I can barely see to land. You sure you want to do this? I looked at my team. Petrov sat hunched in his seat, mumbling in Russian, his eyes unfocused and distant. Ever since the incident at Bravo 4, he'd been talking to himself, having conversations with people who weren't there. Grizz kept a protective hand on the corporal's shoulder, but I could see the worry in the sergeant's weathered face. We need to complete the mission, I said, hating the words even as they left my mouth. The same words that had probably echoed in Tommy's cockpit before his bomber went down. The landing was rough, the helicopter bouncing twice on the uneven ice before settling. As we unloaded our equipment, the pilot grabbed my arm. I'm giving you 2 hours, Captain. Any longer and I won't be able to get back to base before the storm grounds us. Charlie 9 was the oldest of the radar stations, built in the early 1950s when the Cold War was young and the Arctic was still a frontier. The building had been partially buried by years of drifting snow, giving it the appearance of a bunker or a tomb. The radar dish on top moved sluggishly, ice weighing down its metal framework. The door was frozen solid, and it took all of us working together to force it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, like breathing inside a cave. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the equipment banks hummed with an irregular rhythm that set my nerves on edge. Power systems are running on backup, Julia reported, checking her instruments. Main generator must have failed days ago. But it was the radar display that made us all stop and stare. Instead of the normal sweep pattern, The screen showed something impossible. The green lines formed shapes, geometric patterns that pulsed and shifted like living things. At the center of each pattern was a dark spot, like a hole in the light. "Equipment malfunction," O'Donnell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Has to be." Julia connected her diagnostic equipment to the main console, her hands steady despite the cold. "I'm reading signals from locations that shouldn't exist," she said quietly. "The radar is showing returns from beneath the ice, hundreds of feet down." Grizz moved to the radio station, but when he flipped the power switch, nothing happened. The radio was dead, its tubes dark and cold. "No communication with base," he reported. "We're on our own until pickup." That's when Petrov started laughing. It wasn't the sound of humor. It was the broken laugh of a man whose mind had snapped like a dry twig. He stood in front of the radar display, his arms spread wide, talking to the swirling patterns on the screen. "Yes, babushka, I can see you," he said in Russian, then switched to English. "She says the ice remembers everything, every soul that died here. She says they're all waiting down there, in the cold dark, waiting for someone to join them." "Petrov, step away from the equipment," I ordered, but he ignored me. The crying started again, coming from speakers throughout the station. But this time, it wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus. Dozens of women's voices weaving together in a lament that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound made the metal walls vibrate, made my teeth ache with sympathetic resonance. Julia's equipment began registering readings that defied explanation. "Captain, I'm detecting massive electromagnetic anomalies," she said, her voice tight with professional disbelief. "The patterns are too complex to be natural. It's almost like a communication array." O'Donnell was backing away from the radar display, his face pale with terror. "The shapes on the screen," he whispered. "They're moving. They're watching us." I looked at the display and felt my sanity slip another notch. The geometric patterns had changed, becoming more organic, more alive. They pulsed with the rhythm of the crying voices, and at their center, the dark spots had begun to look like eyes. The station's lights flickered, and for a moment, we were plunged into darkness. In that brief blackout, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My brother's voice, clear as day, calling out through the storm. "Henry, help me, Henry. I'm trapped in the ice." When the lights came back on, Petrov was gone. We searched the small station frantically, but there was nowhere to hide. The corporal had simply vanished, leaving behind only his rifle and his radio headset. The exterior door was still barred from the inside. The windows were too small to crawl through, and there was no other way out. "This is impossible," O'Donnell said, his voice rising toward hysteria. "People don't just disappear." But Grizz was examining the floor, near where Petrov had been standing. In the metal grating, there were scratches, the same kind we'd seen around the first station, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but made by something larger than any animal. The crying voices grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were calling our names now. Not just random laments, but specific invitations. Julia's name woven into the chorus, O'Donnell's, Grizz's, and my own, spoken in my brother's voice, begging me to come home. As we huddled together in that haunted station, listening to the storm rage outside and the voices call from below, I finally understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't equipment failure or atmospheric interference. Something was hunting us. something that had been waiting in the ice for a very long time. The storm hit us like God's own fist, turning the world into a howling white void that swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. We'd taken shelter in an abandoned radar bunker, a concrete tomb half buried in decades of drifting snow. The structure groaned and creaked around us like the bones of some ancient beast, fighting against the wind that wanted to tear it apart. "Jesus, listen to that," O'Donnell whispered, his breath visible in the dim light of our emergency lanterns. The storm outside sounded like a freight train made of screaming voices, and underneath it all, that familiar crying we'd been hearing for days. Julia huddled next to the dead radio equipment, still trying to raise bass on different frequencies. Her hands shook as she adjusted the dials, but all we got was static, mixed with that mournful weeping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Still nothing," she reported, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's like the whole world just disappeared." Petrov sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers in Russian. Every few minutes he'd stop and cock his head to one side, as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. His eyes had taken on a glassy, distant look that made my skin crawl. "We need to do a perimeter check," Grizz announced, pulling on his heavy parka. "Make sure this place is secure." I should have stopped him, should have ordered everyone to stay together. But the military training was stronger than my growing fear, and checking the perimeter was standard procedure, even in a place where nothing made sense anymore. "Take your radio," I told him. "Check in every 15 minutes. Grizz nodded and stepped out into the screaming white. The moment the door closed behind him, the bunker felt smaller, more suffocating. The concrete walls seemed to press in on us, and the shadows cast by our lanterns danced like living things. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. "Grizz, report," I called into my radio, but got only static in return. The kind of empty hiss that made you think you were the last person alive in the universe. "Something's wrong," Julia said, stating the obvious. He should have been back by now. O'Donnell was pacing the small space like a caged animal. Maybe he found better shelter. Maybe he's waiting out the storm somewhere else. But even as he said it, we all knew better. Grizz was a professional, a survivor of 2 wars. He wouldn't just disappear without word, not unless something had made him disappear. "We have to look for him," I said, though every instinct screamed against leaving the bunker. We suited up and ventured into the storm, staying roped together like mountain climbers. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked us off our feet, and the snow was so thick I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. We called Grizz's name until our throats were raw, but the storm swallowed our voices like hungry mouths. That's when we found his equipment. His rifle lay half buried in a snowdrift 50 yards from the bunker, the metal already coated with ice. His radio was 20 feet away, crushed as if something had stepped on it. And scattered in a wide circle around these items were pieces of his gear, his compass, his emergency flares, his survival knife, all arranged in a pattern that made no sense. "What the hell?" O'Donnell shouted over the wind. "How does gear get scattered like this?" But it was Julia who noticed the most disturbing detail. "Look at the snow," she said, pointing to the area where we'd found the equipment. "There are no footprints, no drag marks, nothing." She was right. The snow around Grizz's scattered gear was smooth and undisturbed, as if his equipment had simply materialized there. The only marks in the snow were our own boot prints, already being filled by the driving wind. As we stood there trying to make sense of the impossible, my radio crackled to life. "Help!" The voice was weak, distorted by static, but unmistakably Griz's. "She's here. The woman in the ice. She's calling to me. Grizz, where are you?" I shouted into the radio, but the transmission had already faded back to static. We searched for another 2 hours, following the faint radio signals that seemed to come from different directions each time. The voice would emerge from the static every few minutes, always fainter, always more distant, until finally it stopped altogether. When we made it back to the bunker, frozen and exhausted, we found Griz's body. He was sitting in the corner where Petrov had been, his back against the concrete wall, his eyes closed as if he were sleeping. But his skin was blue-white with frostbite, and when I touched his arm, it was hard as stone. He'd been dead for hours. "That's impossible," O'Donnell said, his voice rising toward hysteria. "We just heard him on the radio. We just heard him talking." Julia knelt beside the body, her medical training taking over. "Severe hypothermia," she reported, her voice clinical and detached. "He's been dead since before we left to look for him." But I was staring at something else. In Griz's frozen hand was his radio, and the display was still lit. As I watched, the frequency dial began to move by itself, scanning across the bands, and through the speaker, faint but clear, came the sound of crying. Not the woman's voice we'd been hearing. This was different. This was Grizz, weeping like a lost child, calling out for his mother in a voice that was already fading into the eternal static of the dead. Petrov started laughing then, a sound more terrifying than any scream. He pointed at Griz's corpse and spoke in perfect English, though his accent was thicker than ever. "You see, she takes us one by one. The crying woman. She calls us home. My babushka told me stories, but I thought they were just stories. Now I know better." The bunker's lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a moment. In that brief blackout, I could have sworn I heard another voice, mixed with the radio static. Tommy's voice, calling my name across 30 years of guilt and frozen regret. When the lights came back on, I looked around at what remained of my team. Julia was checking and rechecking her equipment with manic intensity, as if keeping busy could hold back the madness. O'Donnell was sitting in the corner opposite Griz's body, his rifle across his knees, his eyes darting to every shadow. And Petrov was smiling, humming a lullaby his grandmother had probably sung to him as a child. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but underneath its howling, the crying had started again. And this time, I was certain I could hear Griz's voice woven into the lament, adding his sorrow to the chorus of the lost. By the fourth day, none of us were sleeping. Every time we closed our eyes, the crying would start. Not from outside the bunker, but from inside our own heads. The woman's voice had become personal, intimate, speaking to each of us in the language of our deepest fears. Julia was the first to crack. I found her at dawn, clawing at the concrete floor with her bare fingernails, her hands bloody and raw. She'd managed to chip away a small section of the floor, revealing dark ice underneath. "She's down there," Julia whispered, not looking up from her frantic digging. "I can hear her so clearly now. She's been waiting for us. She's been waiting for so long." I tried to pull her away from the hole, but she fought me with surprising strength. "You don't understand," she screamed. "She's not trying to hurt us. She's trying to warn us about the ice, about what happens to people who come too far north. O'Donnell was pressed against the far wall, his rifle pointed at the growing hole in the floor. "Don't let her dig anymore," he said, his voice tight with terror. "Whatever's down there, we don't want to let it out." But Julia had already broken through. Her fingernails scraped against something that wasn't concrete or ice, something that felt organic, soft, like frozen flesh. "Oh God," she breathed. And then she started pulling at the ice with both hands, chunks of it flying as she dug deeper. I can see her face. She's beautiful. She's been crying for so long. I grabbed Julia's shoulders and yanked her back from the hole, but the damage was done. Through the opening she'd created, we could see what lay beneath the bunker's foundation. Preserved in the ice, maybe 6 feet down, was the body of a woman, an Inuit woman, dressed in traditional fur clothing, her dark hair spread around her head like a frozen halo. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth was open, as if she'd been caught in the middle of crying out. Around her throat was a necklace of carved bone, and in her arms she held something small and bundled in fur. A baby. She was holding a baby. The moment we saw her face, the crying stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound we'd heard. It was the silence of held breath, of a predator deciding whether to strike. Petrov crawled over to the hole on his hands and knees, his eyes wide with recognition. "I know her," he whispered. "She's been in my dreams since I was a child." Babushka called her Sila, the spirit of the crying woman. She lost her baby in a storm, wandered out onto the ice looking for him, and froze to death still calling his name. "That's just a story," O'Donnell said, but his voice shook. "Just folklore." "Stories become real when you get this far from civilization," I said, remembering the old Inuit man's warning. "The ice remembers everything." As if in response to my words, the woman's frozen eyes opened. They were completely white, like ice chips, and they looked directly at me. Through the ice, through 6 feet of frozen earth, she saw me. And in that moment, I understood what she wanted. She wanted us to join her, to add our voices to her eternal lament. Julia started weeping then, but it wasn't her own tears. She was crying in the exact rhythm we'd been hearing for days, the same mournful cadence that had been calling to us across the frozen wasteland. O'Donnell backed away from her, his rifle raised, but she wasn't threatening. She was just empty, like something had hollowed her out and filled the space with sorrow. "She's inside my head," Julia said between sobs. "She's showing me things, her baby. She can't find her baby. She's been looking for him for so long, and now she thinks we're him. She thinks we're all her lost children." Petrov was nodding, tears streaming down his face. Yes. She calls to us because we're alone, like she was alone. She wants to take us home, to her home under the ice where the crying never stops." I could feel it too, a pull, like gravity, drawing me toward the hole in the floor. The woman's white eyes held mine, and I heard my brother's voice mixed with her crying. Tommy, calling out through the static of a dead radio, telling me it was time to stop running from the guilt. Time to join him in the place where all the lost souls gather. "We have to get out of here," I said, forcing myself to look away from those terrible eyes. "We have to reach the extraction point." But O'Donnell was laughing now, the sound harsh and broken. "With what? Our equipment's dead, our radio's dead, and there's a blizzard outside that'll freeze us solid in 10 minutes. We're not going anywhere, Captain. We're going to die here, just like she did." He was right, and we all knew it. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Our emergency supplies were running low, and the cold was seeping through the concrete walls like frozen death. We could feel it in our bones, in our lungs, turning our breath to ice crystals that fell like tears. That night, as we huddled around our dying emergency heater, the crying started again. But this time, it was coming from multiple directions. The woman under the ice, yes, but also from the radio that shouldn't have been working, from the walls themselves, from inside our own heads. And woven through it all was Grizz's voice, adding his sorrow to the chorus. He was singing a song I'd never heard before, something in a language that sounded like wind through ice caves. Julia began humming along, and then Petrov joined in, and I realized they were all singing the same song, a lullaby for the lost and the frozen. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was too late. The crying woman had found us, claimed us, and now we were part of her story, part of the eternal vigil for children who would never come home. As the temperature dropped and the walls began to crack with cold, I understood that we weren't just going to die in this place. We were going to become part of it, our voices joining the lament that echoed across the ice for anyone foolish enough to venture too far into the white silence. The woman in the ice had been waiting for us all along, and now, finally, she was no longer alone. If you're still with me through this frozen nightmare, you're braver than my whole team. Hit that subscribe button. You'll need the courage for what comes next. The fifth night brought a silence more terrifying than any storm. The wind died completely, leaving behind a stillness so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Through the bunker's small window, I could see stars for the first time in days. Cold, distant lights that offered no warmth or comfort. The temperature had dropped so far that our breath came out in white clouds that froze and fell to the floor as snow. Julia had stopped trying to dig through the ice. She sat cross-legged beside the hole, staring down at the preserved woman with an expression of terrible understanding. Every few minutes, she would nod, as if responding to a conversation only she could hear. "She's telling me about her baby," Julia said, her voice dreamy and distant. His name was Cascade. He was 2 years old when the storm came. She wrapped him in sealskin and told him to wait while she went for help. But when she came back, Julia trailed off, tears freezing on her cheeks. The ice had taken him. She spent 3 days looking, calling his name, until the cold took her too. O'Donnell was methodically checking his rifle for the 100th time, his movements mechanical and precise. "It's just a story," he kept repeating. "Dead is dead. Frozen is frozen. There's no magic in the world, just cold and death and equipment failure." But his hands were shaking, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We'd all seen impossible things, heard voices from the dead, watched our equipment malfunction in ways that defied explanation. The rational world we'd known was cracking like ice under pressure. Petrov had curled up in the corner, humming his grandmother's lullabies. Sometimes he would stop and have conversations with empty air, speaking in rapid Russian, his voice rising and falling as if he were arguing with someone. When I asked him what he was saying, he just smiled. "Babushka is explaining things to me," he said. "She says the woman in the ice is not evil. She is just lonely. She has been alone for so long that she forgets the difference between the living and the dead." That's when the real crying started. Not the distant weeping we'd grown accustomed to, but a sound so immediate and raw, it felt like it was coming from inside our own chests. The woman beneath the ice had opened her mouth, and sound was pouring out. Not just her voice, but the voices of everyone who had ever died in the Arctic. Explorers and hunters, soldiers and scientists, all of them calling out across the frozen darkness. The ice around her body began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading outward from where she lay. Water seeped up through the fissures, impossibly warm in the sub-zero temperature, and with it came the smell of earth and decay and something else, something that smelled like home. "She's coming up," Julia whispered, and there was no fear in her voice anymore, only acceptance. "She's finally coming up to collect us." The concrete floor of the bunker began to buckle and split as more ice cracked beneath us. Through the widening gaps, we could see the woman's body rising, floating upward through the dark water like a cork in a bottle. Her white eyes remained fixed on us, and her mouth moved in the rhythm of the crying, forming words in a language older than English, older than Russian, older than any human tongue. O'Donnell finally snapped. He started firing his rifle into the hole, the muzzle flashes lighting up the bunker like lightning. The bullets disappeared into the dark water without effect, and the recoil knocked him backward with each shot. "Stay down!" he screamed. "Stay dead! You're dead, you hear me? You're dead and gone and buried." But the woman kept rising. Her head broke the surface of the water, dark hair floating around her face like seaweed. Ice crystals clung to her skin, and when she breathed, frost poured from her lungs. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, sharp and cold, and absolutely deadly. In her arms, she still held the bundle of fur that had been her baby. But now I could see that it wasn't a child at all. It was just frozen air, shaped by a mother's desperate love into something that felt real. The woman had been holding nothing for decades, cradling emptiness and calling it by her son's name. She looked at each of us in turn, and when her gaze met mine, I heard Tommy's voice clear as day. "Henry," my brother said, though it was the ice woman's mouth that moved. "I've been waiting for you, Henry. I've been so cold, so alone. Why didn't you save me?" "You're not Tommy," I said, but my voice cracked. "Tommy died in Korea. His bomber crashed in the mountains." The woman smiled, and ice fell from her lips like broken teeth. "The ice remembers all the lost children," she said in Tommy's voice. "Your brother, my son, all of them. They're here with me now, in the cold dark where nothing changes and nothing dies. Don't you want to see him again?" She held out her arms, and for a moment, just a moment, I could see Tommy standing behind her. He looked exactly as he had the last time I'd seen him, young and eager and afraid to show it. He was wearing his flight jacket, and there was frost in his hair. "Come home, Henry," he said. "Stop carrying this guilt. Stop running from what you couldn't control. Just let go." I took a step toward the hole, then another. The water looked warm and inviting, and I could feel the weight of 30 years of guilt lifting from my shoulders. All I had to do was step into the water, let the ice woman wrap me in her arms, and I could be with Tommy again. We could be lost children together forever. That's when Julia screamed. Not the crying we'd been hearing, but a sound of pure human terror that cut through the supernatural fog clouding my mind. I turned to see her clawing at her own face, trying to stop herself from moving toward the hole. "She's not just lonely," Julia gasped between screams. She's hungry. She's been feeding on the loneliness and guilt of everyone who dies out here. She doesn't want to comfort us. She wants to consume us. The ice woman's beautiful face twisted into something terrible and predatory. Her white eyes rolled back in her head, showing only empty sockets, and her mouth opened wider than any human mouth should open. Inside, instead of teeth, there was only darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows light and hope and life itself. "Too late," she said, and now her voice was the sound of wind through a graveyard. "You've seen me. You've heard my calling. Now you belong to the ice, just like all the others." The bunker's walls began to crack, and through the fissures came more water, more ice, more of the woman's terrible hunger. I could see other shapes moving in the dark water, the bodies of everyone who had ever answered her call. Grizz was there, his eyes white and empty, still weeping, and behind him, other figures I didn't recognize. Decades worth of lost souls, all of them reaching up toward us with frozen hands. "Run!" I shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The bunker was filling with ice water, and the woman was rising from her frozen grave like a nightmare made real. O'Donnell emptied his rifle into her, but she didn't even flinch. The bullets passed through her as if she were made of mist, and she kept coming, her arms outstretched, ready to embrace us all in her deadly love. Petrov was laughing again, but now it was the laughter of complete madness. He walked straight toward the hole, his arms open wide. "Yes, babushka," he said. "Yes, I understand now. We're all her children. We're all lost in the ice." The woman caught him in her arms, and for a moment, he looked peaceful, happy even. Then the ice began to form around him, spreading up from where she touched him, turning his skin blue-white and his eyes to frozen glass. He was still smiling when the cold reached his heart and stopped it forever. Julia and O'Donnell were backing toward the door, but I could see the hunger in the ice woman's eyes. She wasn't going to let any of us leave. We'd disturbed her rest, seen her face, and now we had to pay the price. The bunker was collapsing around us, filling with ice and water and the voices of the dead. Through it all, the woman kept crying, kept calling, kept reaching out with arms that promised peace, but delivered only frozen death. As the water rose around my knees, as the ice began to form on my skin, I finally understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a ghost story or a legend. This was something older and hungrier than human understanding. Something that had been waiting in the ice since before the first humans walked across the frozen sea. The crying woman had found us at last, and now, like all the others who had ventured too far into her domain, we were going to join her eternal chorus of the lost and the damned. The last thing I saw before the ice closed over my head was Tommy's face, twisted with the same terrible hunger as the woman who held him. My brother reached out to me through the dark water, his frozen fingers grasping for my throat. "Come home, Henry," he whispered as the cold took me. "Come home, where the crying never stops." They wrapped me in thermal blankets and pumped warm saline into my veins, but I couldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, from the sound that followed us all the way back to base. Even over the helicopter's rotor wash, I could hear her crying, growing fainter, but never truly fading. The debriefing room at DEWPOW3 smelled like disinfectant and burned coffee. Major Collins sat across from me, his pale eyes studying my bandaged hands, while a tape recorder hummed between us. A Navy psychiatrist named Commander Pierce took notes in a leather folder. occasionally glancing up at me like I was a specimen under glass. "Tell us what happened to your team, Captain Strauss." I tried to explain about the woman in the ice, about the crying that had driven us mad one by one. The words came out wrong, jumbled, like trying to describe color to a blind man. How do you explain supernatural hunger to men who live by regulations and radio frequencies? Severe psychological trauma, Pierce murmured to Collins. Auditory hallucinations, survivor's guilt, possible hypothermic psychosis. He'll need extensive treatment. They'd already found the bodies. Julia frozen solid at the collapsed bunker, her fingers still bloody from clawing at the ice. O'Donnell scattered across a half-mile of sea ice, his rifle empty, brass casings forming a perfect circle. The sound of rotor blades cut through my frozen dreams like salvation with steel teeth. I woke up face down in the snow, my left arm twisted beneath me at an angle that should have been agony. But I felt nothing. The cold had taken that from me, along with 3 fingers on my right hand and most of my sanity. The rescue helicopter circled twice before landing, its searchlight sweeping across the scattered wreckage of our equipment. Through the whipping snow, I saw figures in orange survival suits running toward me, their voices lost in the engine noise. "Survivor! We have a survivor," around where they'd found his head. Petrov sitting upright in a snowdrift, like he was waiting for a bus, his eyes open but frosted white. "Equipment failure," Collins said, reading from his report. "Radio malfunction led to mist extraction. Extreme weather conditions caused disorientation and hypothermic dementia. The survivors became separated during a blizzard." Survivor, singular, as if the others had never existed. "The tapes from your equipment were corrupted," Pierce added, closing his folder. "Water damage, most likely. Nothing recoverable." But I'd seen him listening to something through headphones before I'd entered the room. His face had gone pale, and he'd ejected the tape quickly, like it had burned his fingers. They'd heard her voice. They just couldn't admit it existed. "There was a woman," I said again, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Under the ice. She was calling to us." Pierce made another note. "Hypothermic hallucinations are common in extreme cold exposure, Captain. The brain creates false sensory input to cope with trauma. They processed my discharge papers with military efficiency. Honorable service, psychological disability, full pension benefits. Everything neat and clean, filed away like it had never happened, like my team had never existed. The last thing Collins said to me was, 'You're lucky to be alive, Strauss.' Most men don't walk away from the ice. But as I left the base that final time, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, I knew he was wrong. I hadn't walked away from anything. I'd brought the ice with me, and it was never going to let me go." That night, alone in a Fairbanks motel room, I heard her crying through the heating vents. Soft at first, then louder, until I had to turn the television up to drown out the sound. The local news was showing footage of the rescue operation, aerial shots of the abandoned radar stations where we'd lost our minds. The reporter mentioned 4 military personnel confirmed dead, 1 survivor in stable condition. No names, no details, just numbers for the official record. I turned off the TV and lay in the dark, listening to the woman weep for her lost children. In 30 years, I'd never found a place far enough south to escape that sound. 30 years later, the crying still wakes me at 3 a.m. I'm living in Phoenix now, as far from the Arctic as I can get without leaving the country. The desert heat should have burned away every memory of that frozen hell. But some things go deeper than climate. Some things live in your bones. I've spent 3 decades researching what happened to us out there. Library archives, newspaper morgues, military records I wasn't supposed to access. The pattern goes back further than I'd imagined. Hudson Bay Company fur traders in the 1800s, Klondike prospectors, even some of the early DW line personnel. All of them reported the same thing before they disappeared. A woman's voice crying in the Arctic wind. The Inuit have stories going back centuries. They call her Silla, the spirit of the Ice Mother. A woman who lost her child in a blizzard, searched until the cold took her, and now calls to anyone who ventures too far into her domain. She mistakes them for her lost son, draws them down into the ice, where they can weep together forever. My brother Tommy's bomber had crashed 53 miles from our radar station. I found that detail in a classified report that cost me $2,000 and a favor I'll never admit to. 53 miles, close enough for his voice to reach me through her eternal lament. Sometimes I wonder if I really survived that mission, or if I'm still frozen in that bunker, dreaming of rescue, while the ice slowly claims what's left of my sanity. The doctors say that's just trauma talking, but they've never heard her voice threading through the static of a dead radio. Last week I got a phone call that made my blood freeze colder than any Arctic wind. Uncle Henry? It's David. David Strauss. Tommy's boy, all grown up and wearing Air Force blues. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. His voice sounded exactly like his father's. "I'm being deployed to Alaska," he said, excitement bubbling through the phone. "Do POW 3. They're upgrading the radar systems, and they need experienced technicians. I know you served up there. Thought you might have some advice." My hands started shaking so hard, I nearly dropped the phone. "David, listen to me very carefully. You need to decline that assignment. Find a way out. Transfer to anywhere else." "What? Why?" "Uncle Henry, this is a career opportunity. The Arctic radar systems are cutting-edge technology." "There are things up there," I said, knowing how crazy I sounded. "Things that shouldn't exist. Your father. Your father died because I couldn't protect him. I won't let the same thing happen to you." The line went quiet for a long moment. When David spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "Uncle Henry, I know you had a rough time up there. Mom told me about your difficulties, but that was 30 years ago. I'm not my father, and this isn't 1961. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. Outside, the Phoenix sun blazed down on concrete and palm trees, but I could feel winter creeping into my bones. The woman in the ice was calling again, and this time she had a new voice to use. Tommy's voice, speaking through his son's mouth. Tonight, as I write this, the crying is louder than it's been in years. It's coming from the north, carried on desert winds that should be too hot for Arctic spirits. But the ice remembers everything, and distance means nothing to the dead. David ships out next week. I've booked a flight to Anchorage. Some warnings are worth passing on, even if no one believes them. Even if it means following the crying woman's voice, back to the place where my soul froze solid 30 years ago. The ice is calling me home, and this time I'm going to answer. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. If you know someone in the military, maybe share this tale. Some warnings are worth passing on. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that shouldn't be true, but are.